Wote Street was variously written Wote Street or Oat Street. At one time it seemed that the market overflowed into Wote Street. They findeth that the market folk set their wares in the Oat Street, whereby children and many others stand in great jeopardy. And again in 1511, also the men of the country tie their horses and mares in the street, which is jeopardy for children. Basingstoke was most probably the birthplace of Walter de Merton, regarded by his biographer as the most munificent and probably the ablest statesman and prelate of the 13th century. His parents certainly lived and died here, and were buried in the churchyard. His many offices as Lord Chancellor of England, Bishop of Rochester, and founder of Merton College, Oxford, must have made him an infrequent visitor to Basingstoke, but he didn't forget his native town. About the year 1240, he endowed the Hospital of St. John the Baptist, which stood on the site of the present St. John's School, between Brook Street and Church Street. It was to be for the support of the ministers of the altar of the Lord, whose strength is failing, and the wayfaring poor of Christ. King Henry III granted letters of protection, and it was constituted a royal hospital, but all traces of the building have long since disappeared. Disastrous fires figure prominently in Basingstoke's history. They are one reason why so little remains of the medieval town. The first recorded fire occurred in 1392. Then, in answer to the people's petition, King Richard II granted the following rights.
Be it known unto all, that, taking into consideration the serious injury and utter loss which the good men of our town of Basingstoke have sustained by the ravages of the sudden and unforeseen fire which lately happened in the said town, and from which they will necessarily suffer for a long time to come, and wishing to extend a helping hand in the relief of our aforesaid town, and of the aforesaid men, who by this misfortune, as well as by other calamities, are greatly impoverished and oppressed, we grant of our own especial grace, for ourselves and our heirs, to the aforesaid town, that they and their heirs and successors shall be for ever a community in themselves, and for all time shall possess a common seal.
Early in the 13th century, during the reign of King John, when burial in the churchyard was forbidden by papal interdict, the people chose a new burial ground to the north of the town, and here they built a chapel, and a group of people formed themselves into the Guild of the Fraternity of the Holy Ghost, which maintained a chaplain there to say masses for the souls of the dead. Towards the end of the medieval period, the Church of St. Michael, which was so named because of its connection with the Abbey of Mont-Saint-Michel in Normandy, was rebuilt. It had by that time been transferred to the care of the new Priory of Selborne, and in an account roll of the Priory for 1464-5 is an entry of £22.10 for the new building of the chancel, the only part of this church to survive. Through this period and up to the 17th century, the prosperity of Basingstoke was built on wool. Sheep outnumbered human beings. John Kinnion, a merchant of Basingstoke, had licence to export wool in 1273. Yet in spite of its wool trade, its market, its church building, if we could see medieval Basingstoke as it was, it would seem in our eyes no more than an overgrown village, the country never far from the town. That is a quality it has retained right up to the present day. Most of the country round about, in fact most of England, was covered by forest, through which travellers made their way with difficulty by tracks from one village or clearing to the next. With one exception, which involved Basing rather than Basingstoke, its story is singularly free of the strife and hurly-burly of our national history in the period of the Tudors and Stuarts. The period of peaceful prosperity which followed when the Tudors were firmly in the throne was, however, reflected in a new wave of building. The nave of St Michael's Church was entirely rebuilt in 1510, when the church largely took its present form. The porch was added 20 years later. The improvements or changes that occurred in Victorian and modern times have been largely confined to the internal furnishings. Of uncertain date, but probably of this period, is Church Cottage, a building which has been put to various uses at different times. Part was certainly the rectory, and the hall at the back was most likely used as a tithe barn, although it's also shown on a later plan as a malt house. The reign of Henry VIII saw the rise to wealth and honours of Sir William Sandys, member of a distinguished Hampshire family. He was created Lord Sandys of the Vine on the 23rd of April 1523. This estate, just to the north of Basingstoke, a contemporary writer said,
"At which time there was no very great or sumptuous manor place, and was only contained within the moat. But he after so translated and augmented it, and besides builded a fair base court, that at this time it is one of the principal houses in goodly building of all Hamptonshire."
It was here that Sandys was visited several times by Henry VIII. The same Lord Sandys built on to the Holy Ghost Chapel at Basingstoke the Chapel of the Holy Trinity as a burial place for his family. Although no more than a romantic ruin for at least 2 centuries, it's still probably the best-known landmark in the town. The Elizabethan historian Camden, describing the interior, wrote,
"In the arched and embossed roof was to be seen the holy history of the Bible, painted most artificially with living portraits and images, representing the prophets, the apostles, and the disciples of Christ."
When the chapel was built, Lord Sandys re-established the Guild of the Holy Ghost and endowed it with an estate for the maintenance of a priest to perform divine service in the chapel, and therein likewise to instruct youths in literature. This fraternity escaped the general dissolution and remained till the first year of King Edward VI's reign, 1546, when an Act of Parliament was passed whereby free chapels and chantries of all sorts, and the estates belonging to them, were given to the king, in consequence of which act this fraternity was dissolved and their estate taken for the king's use. It remained vested in the crown till the year 1556, when the inhabitants of Basingstoke petitioned their Majesties King Philip and Queen Mary. Their petition was backed by the intercession of Cardinal Boole, the Pope's legate, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, so the Guild was by their Majesties' letters patent re-established, and endowed with the same estate as it had possessed at its suppression. The estate was to be applied to the same purposes. Richard White, or as he chose to call himself following the custom of his day, Ricardus Vetus Basingstokius, was born in Basingstoke and educated at Winchester and Oxford. For the remainder of his life he lived on the continent. An eminent scholar, he wrote a history of Britain from the first planting of this nation to Brute, and so on to Constantius and Cadwallader in 9 books. Without doubt the most colourful personality who ever had the right to call himself a Basingstoker was Sir James Lancaster, one of the leading seamen of the reign of Elizabeth. The zenith of his career came in the year 1600, when he sailed in command of an expedition to the East Indies to found the East India Company. The expedition was successful, and James Lancaster was knighted on his return. He died in Basingstoke in 1618. In his will, he left legacies to his native town, totalling £100 a year for education. Queen Elizabeth I in her royal processions was, like her father, a visitor to these parts on several occasions. In the year 1601 she was the guest of the Marquis of Winchester at Basing House for a period of 13 days, to the great charge of the said Lord Marquis. During her residence there, the Duke of Biron, accompanied by about 20 of the French nobility and a retinue of nearly 400 persons, were lodged at the Vine, the seat of Lord Sandys, which house had been purposely furnished with hangings and plate from the Tower and Hampton Court, and with 70 beds and furniture, which the willing and obedient people of the country of Southampton, upon 2 days' warning, had brought in thither to lend the Queen. When Elizabeth departed from Basing, she affirmed that
she had done that in Hampshire that none of her ancestors ever did, neither that any prince in Christendom could do. That was, she had in her progresses in her subjects' houses entertained a royal ambassador, and had royally entertained him.
During this visit, fire again swept through the town.
Other news there is none, but the woeful and most pitiful burning of Basingstoke on Wednesday the 16th of this instant, where is consumed with fire 14 fine houses, besides barns and stables.
One reason why these fires spread so rapidly was the timber construction of most of the buildings. These surviving cottages in Chapel Street may well be the ones referred to in the next century in the church warden's accounts for 1778. April the 7th, paid David Thumwood for thatching the cottages in Chapel Street and straw, as per bill, £3 14 7. As far as we know, this is one of the only 2 thatched cottages remaining within the borough boundary. To the glory of God, and for the relief of 8 poor, aged, and impotent persons successively, and for a monument of his zeal to the good of this town of Basingstoke, his native soil, Sir James Dean, Knight, founded this almshouse, and endowed the same with an ample revenue to be continued for ever. Anno Domini 1608. About the same period, the ornamental brick gable end was added to the house in Church Street, described in the last century as overhanging the River Loddon. Two of the 8 bells in the church belfry were already in use when James I came to the throne. Down through the ages they've been rung not only for services, but also to celebrate the King's birthday, coronation, or national victories. A bell was formerly rung at 4 o'clock every morning to summon labourers to work. This was discontinued about 1850. John Paulet, the 5th Marquis of Winchester, whose father had entertained Queen Elizabeth, was the nobleman who rendered his name immortal by his defence of Basing House in the cause of Charles I, during a tedious siege or blockade, or rather a succession of them, which with short intermissions lasted for 2 years. The first attack by parliamentary forces was made in August 1643, and was repulsed with heavy losses to the attackers. The besieging forces regathered on the high ground to the north of Basing, and where direct attack had failed, shortage of provisions within the house caused by the blockade made the defenders' position